Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. No stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree.
Coffee. Without it, we would never have had the Industrial Revolution. We'd all be still living in Europe in mud huts. Here in Laredo, we have the Organic Man Coffee Trike. 4501 McPherson, the best coffee on the planet. If you can't get to Laredo, you can order from the Organic Man Coffee Trike .shop. Welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Here we are once again. David Subith wrote to me and asked me to check into this next little item. He was curious about whether or not General Patton may have been murdered. So I tried looking into it, and, well, here's what I could find. Hope y'all enjoy it. Some folks barely have any kind of an effect on those around them. They go through life without accomplishing much. Others have caused the direction of the entire planet to change course. Love him or hate him, George Patton was quite a guy. The Patton family was Irish, Scotch-Irish, English, Scottish, French, and Wales ancestry. Robert Patton was the first member of the family to be listed here in the United States. He immigrated to Culpeper, Virginia from Glasgow, maybe 1769 or 1770. They're not even too sure. The records are kind of mixed up back then. His paternal grandfather was George Smith Patton, who commanded the 22nd Virginia Infantry under Jubal Early in the Civil War, and he was killed at the Third Battle of Winchester. I guess I got Robert Patton in the wrong list there. He was one of the members of the family. T. Patton, all they've got is his first initial, was killed at Pickett's charge during the Battle of Gettysburg. Now you'll notice all these guys were on the side of the Confederacy. The family was involved in lots of military endeavors throughout their history. Patton is also a descendant of the French Huguenot Louis de Bois. Huguenots were French Protestants in the 16th and the 17th century who followed the teachings of theologian John Calvin. They were prosecuted by the French Catholic government during a violent period of time. Huguenots fled the country in the 17th century, creating settlements all over Europe. Hans Hakim Marcel was also a descendant of the Huguenots who fled persecution. Only instead of heading to Western Europe, his family moved east. He wound up serving in the German army during World War II. I'll get to him on another show some other time. That guy was a character. George Smith Patton Jr. was born on November 11th, 1885 in Los Angeles. The Patton family resided at Lake Vineyard, built by Benjamin Wilson on 128 acres of land, so the family had money. He had a younger sister named Anne, who was nicknamed Nita. Nita became engaged to John Pershing, who was also quite a character. The wedding never took place because Pershing shipped off to France in World War I, and I guess she didn't want to wait. Patton believed he was a former soldier from the past He had fought in many wars way, way back to the time of the Greeks. He also was a descendant, although not directly, of George Washington's family. They had connections, but not directly. As a child, Patton had difficulty learning to read and write, but eventually he overcame this and he was known as quite an avid reader as an adult. He had to be tutored at home until the age of 11. He enrolled in the Stephen Cutter Clark Classic School for Boys. This is back when the boys went to one school and the girls went to another. The boys were taught how to do things, and girls were mostly taught how to cook and sew and take care of houses. Like, that's all they were good for. But hey, this was another time. Back then, that's how things were done. Patton liked to read historical accounts of battles from the past. People like Hannibal and Africanus and Julius Caesar, Napoleon Bonaparte, things like that. I guess he wasn't into fiction. He never considered a career anywhere other than the military. Kind of like Lieutenant Dan from that movie. At the age of 17, he tried to get into the United States Military Academy at West Point. He applied to several universities that had reserve officer training, and he was picked up by Virginia Military Institute, or VMI. You'd expect that since his father and grandfather both went there as well. He was there from 1903 to 1904, and he was having a hard time reading and writing even at this time. So he was not the top of his class. He had to repeat the first year. Correction, that was at West Point. But he was not real good at reading and writing. He was given a nomination to attend West Point by the state senator. In his first year at West Point, Patton adjusted to the routine. He was academically kind of poor, and that's why he had to repeat the first year. He was also on the football team, but he injured his arm and he couldn't continue playing football. So instead, he went out for fencing and track and field. He graduated 46th out of 103 cadets. At the age of 24, Patton married Beatrice Ayer. They had 3 children, Beatrice Smith, Ruth Ellen, and George Patton IV. Patton was one of the top swordsmen at West Point, and one of his accomplishments was that he redesigned their saber, which they used to have that long curved blade, and he made it into a straight blade. And instead of slicing and hacking, he said that they should thrust and stab. Ouch. Anyway, either way, it's going to hurt. Patton's first posting was to the 15th Cavalry Unit at Fort Sheridan, Illinois. 1911, he was transferred to Fort Myer. He had a high-pitched voice, and this kind of worried him, as well as others, whether or not he would be able to instill confidence in men. See if I can get this thing to play. I had it on my soundboard, and of course, it's not there anymore. But see if this will come through or not. This is Patton giving a speech. Hopefully.
You must remember this, that from Brest to various towns in southern Germany and Austria, whose names I can't pronounce, but whose places I have removed.
Oh yeah, that was Patton giving a speech after World War II. Not exactly what you'd call a John B. Wells when it came to speaking. As a 26-year-old Army cavalry officer, Patton was selected to compete in the first Olympics held in Stockholm. Of the 42 competitors, he finished in 5th place. The judges said that Patton had missed the target with one of his shots. He argued that he'd put all the rounds kind of through one big hole right in the middle of the target. Well, You can't argue with those judges because most of them, well, anyway, they had their reasons for things like that. He was also supposed to attend the second Olympics in 1916, but World War I kind of put a kibosh on that. In 1915, Lieutenant Patton was assigned to the Border Patrol duties. This was what the Army did back then, in the 8th Cavalry at Sierra Blanca, Texas. During his time there, Patton took to wearing his 1911 Colt stuck in his belt instead of his holster. That's not a good way to do it. His pistol discharged accidentally one night, and he stopped carrying the 1911, and he started carrying a Army Colt revolver instead. For those of you that don't know about weapons, the 1911 pistol is designed and intended to be carried with the hammer back. In other words, it's cocked and ready to go. You then have the manual thumb safety that is engaged, as well as there's a grip safety. They have dropped 1911s off of 3-story buildings without them discharging. The only way his pistol could have gone off in his belt is if he had his arm resting on the grip safety. Let's just say that Patton knew a lot about horses and swords, but he wasn't much on pistols. In March 1916, Mexican forces loyal to Pancho Villa crossed into New Mexico and raided the border town of Columbus. Several Americans were killed. In response, the U.S. launched the Pancho Villa expedition into Mexico. Patton was not assigned to this expedition, so he contacted General Pershing, who was in charge, and asked to be reassigned. Trouble between the United States and Pancho Villa had been growing ever since October 1915, when the United States government officially recognized Villa's rival, Venustiano Carranza, as the head of the government of Mexico. The U.S. also provided rail transport for his soldiers, 5,000 of them, to travel from El Paso to Douglas, Arizona. All this for the president of Mexico, so that they could fight at the Battle of Agua Prieta against Villa. November 26, 1915, Villa sent a force to attack a city in Nogales, and in the course of the battle, he ran into a group of American soldiers. January 11th, 1916, 16 American employees of the American Smelting and Refining Company were executed. March 9th, 1916, Villa's troops attacked Columbus, New Mexico, and Camp Furlong. 10 civilians and 8 soldiers were killed in the attack, and 2 civilians and 6 soldiers were wounded. The raiders burnt the town down, stole horses, mules, and they seized machine guns, ammunition, and a lot of merchandise. They just kind of raided all the stores and took what they could grab. Then they headed back into Mexico. Villa's soldiers had suffered considerable losses, with at least 67 dead and dozens more wounded. The raiders made it back into Mexico, and President Wilson decided no more of this, and so he contacted General Pershing and told him to go get Villa. If you looked at photos of Pancho Villa on the internet, you'll see that in one of them, General Pershing and Lieutenant Patton are standing with Villa when he visited Fort Bliss in El Paso, Texas, from August 1914. Like a lot of government operations, the expedition wasn't well equipped. It's kind of like the president said, attack Mexico and get Villa, but then he didn't bother to make any form of arrangements for equipment and supplies. To make matters worse, Carranza refused to allow the U.S. to use his railroad, and he didn't support the efforts to track down Villa, which I don't understand, seeing as Villa was his opponent. Well, they did engage Villa's troops in a few battles, but they never managed to catch up with the man himself. Eventually, Wilson pulled all the forces out of Mexico and told them to focus more on keeping people out of the country and not worry about going and getting them. After the expedition, Patton was detailed to Fort Riley, Virginia, to oversee horse procurement for the Army, what amounted to driving a desk. When the United States entered World War I, Pershing was named the commander of the American forces, and he requested that Patton be made his aide. I guess he liked the way the man worked. Patton was promoted to captain in 1917, and they left for Europe. Among the 180 men of Pershing's advance party, Patton oversaw the training of the troops while in Paris until September. Then they moved to, and these names are all in French, so I'll probably mispronounce them. They moved to Chaumont and was assigned as a post adjutant commanding the headquarters company that were overseeing the base. In other words, another desk job. Up until the Great War, as it was called, it was also called the War to End All Wars, and some people refer to it as World War I. It was still considered the way to fight a battle to line up and charge headlong into the enemy lines. Some troops were still on horseback. Equipment was pulled on wagons. Infantry was the main means of winning a battle. The so-called experts said that airplanes had no use in combat. The first time an airplane was used by the military was February 1911. Lieutenant Fowlis and pilot Philip Parmalee took off from Fort McIntosh in Laredo. The pair conducted the first ever air reconnaissance along the Rio Grande River. Their mission was to look for Mexican revolutionaries who were constantly invading towns and villages along the U.S. border. The experts all said that airplanes had no possible military use. By 1915, the First World War was in a stalemate, with thousands of soldiers dying daily along the 450 miles of fortified trenches that ran from Belgium to France. The deadlock could only be broken by finding a way to breach the trench system. The idea was they were going to build armored vehicles that could drive across no man's land, cross a trench without having to slow down, and get in behind the enemy. Total security was used during the development of this vehicle. The vehicles were called land ships, and so the Navy was in charge of them at first. To keep the spies from discovering what was being built, the word was put out that these vehicles were for carrying water. They were called mobile water tanks. The first use of a tank was September 15, 1916, at the Battle of the Somme. Early tanks with top speed of 4 miles an hour proved mechanically unreliable, and they were vulnerable to shell fire. All the enemy had to do was drop rounds down on top of them until they hit the target because they were going so slow. Conditions inside were less than favorable. To begin with, it was about 120 degrees. Talk about a sweat box. Come to think of it, tanks today, well, when I was in a tank, it was about that hot. Anyway, they had an 8-man crew that would become sick because of the exhaust that was pouring all over inside the vehicle, and there was no way to communicate once the lids were closed. Somebody had to stick their arm out and wave a flag back and forth to let the tanks behind them know what to do. As the metal beasts came plowing out across no man's land, many German soldiers broke ranks and ran. Well, once they stopped running, they realized that these were just motorized vehicles with men in them, and so Germany started designing their own tanks. They called it the A7V, which, like other tanks of the period, was based on a Caterpillar track. Initially unconvinced that tanks were a serious threat, the High Command ordered just 20 A7Vs, which took part in a handful of actions between March and October 1918. They suffered from design faults, shoddy workmanship. It seems anybody that builds anything for the military, they make it about as crappy as you can. Germany actually used captured British tanks more than their own. They would simply slap a big cross on the side and say, "This is ours," and turn it around and send it back to the British lines. Patton was dissatisfied with mostly driving a desk while there was actual shooting war going on. Most officers looked at tanks as a means of getting the infantry across the enemy lines. The tank would roll out across no man's land, and then the infantry would all walk behind it, kind of using it as a big shield. And then once they were in the trenches, they would go back to hand combat. Well, Patton saw the tank as being the future of warfare. November 10th, 1917, Patton was assigned to establish the Light Tank School. He left Paris and reported to the French Army Tank Training School at Champlou, I believe it is, where he drove a Renault FT light tank. On November 20th, the British launched an offensive towards the important rail center of Cambrai, using tanks. 378 Mark IV tanks attacked a supply point for the German army. The action kind of served as the blueprint for the successful 100-day offensive of 1918. All tank battles were kind of based on this one battle. Ever wonder why Germany gets blamed for starting the Great War? The whole thing started between Austria and Serbia. Russia supported Serbia, so they declared war on Austria. Germany had a treaty with Austria, so they declared war on Russia. France and Belgium sided with Serbia, so Germany invaded France, and they managed to get within 30 miles of Paris before having to dig in. That digging just kept going, leading to trench warfare. Both sides were borrowing tons of cash from a certain banking family who will remain unnamed since I don't want any trouble. At the end of the war, someone was going to have to pay back all those bad loans. The Austrian Empire collapsed, so Germany was chosen to pay all that war debt. This collapsed the German economy. That international banking family became enormously wealthy. See, they loaned money to both sides. So no matter who won, they still came out on top. Patton managed to be promoted to major on January 26th of 1918. He received the first 10 tanks in March at the tank school in Bourg. Patton was the only U.S. soldier who could drive a tank. And so he was running around driving all these tanks, getting them lined up for the soldiers. You don't often find a major driving a tank in the Army. He began training tank crews to operate in support of infantry. And he promoted its acceptance among reluctant infantry officers. Having a bit of tongue-tied and twisted trouble here. He was promoted to lieutenant colonel in 1918, and he attended the Command and General Staff College in Langres. August 1918, he was placed in charge of the U.S. 1st Provisional Tank Brigade. He personally oversaw the logistics use of the tanks in their first combat by U.S. forces, and he reconnoitered the target area for the first attack himself. Instead of relying on some first lieutenant or second lieutenant to run out, look around, come back, and tell him what was what, Patton went out and looked. He ordered that no U.S. tank was to ever surrender, no matter what. You were supposed to destroy it before giving up, if possible. Patton commanded American crewed Renault FT tanks at the Battle of St. Mihiel, leading the tanks from the very front of the march of their attack, which began on September 12th. He led from the front. He walked in front of the tanks as they moved into German-held village of Issei, and he rode on top of the tank during the attack into Piness, seeking to inspire his men. I'll get to more on that later. Now, Patton's brigade was then moved to support the Meuse-Argonne offensive on September 26th. He personally led a troop of tanks through thick fog as they advanced 5 miles into German lines. He walked in front of the tanks. At around 9 o'clock, Patton was wounded while leading 6 men in a tank in an attack on German machine guns near the town of Chipai. His orderly, Private First Class Joe Angelo, saved Patton, for which he was later awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Instead of being hustled to the rear to be ministered to by the medics, Patton commanded the battle from a shell hole for an hour before he would allow them to remove him from the scene. Although the 35th Division eventually captured Verness, it did so with heavy losses. Trying to move his reserve tanks forward, Patton related that he might have killed one of his own men. He kind of had a habit of doing this. Patton said in his diary, "Some of my reserve tanks were stuck in some trenches. So I went back and I made some Americans hiding in a trench dig a passage. I think I killed one man here. He would not work, so I hit him in the head with a shovel." He had a reputation for hitting people that wouldn't do what he told them to do. Patton wrote a letter to his wife. "The bullet went into the front of my left leg and came out just at the crack of my bottom, about 2 inches left of my rectum. It was fired from about 160 feet, so it made a hole about the size of a silver dollar where it came out." Well, at least he didn't say he was shot in the buttocks. While recuperating from his wounds, Patton was breveted to colonel in the Tank Corps of the U.S. Army. A brevet promotion means you do the job, but you don't retain the position. Custer was a brevet general. At the end of the Civil War, he was knocked back to being a captain. Patton returned to duty October 28th, but saw no further action before hostilities ended on his 33rd birthday, the armistice, which took place November 11th, 1918. For his actions at Chipai, Patton received the Distinguished Service Cross, and for his leadership at the tank school, he got the Distinguished Service Medal, and he received a Purple Heart. After the war, he was assigned to Camp Meade, Maryland, and reverted to his original rank of captain. Even though he'd been promoted all the way to colonel, when the war was over, they didn't need him as a colonel, so back to captain. He was then promoted the next day to major once again. Patton was given temporary duty in Washington, D.C. To serve on a committee writing a manual on tank operations. During this time, he developed a belief that tanks should be used not as infantry support, but rather as an independent fighting force. He supported the M1919 tank design created by Walter Christie, a project which was shelved due to financial considerations. While on duty in Washington, Patton met with Dwight D. Eisenhower, who would play an enormous role in Patton's future. During and following Patton's assignment in Hawaii, he and Eisenhower corresponded back and forth, and Patton sent him all kinds of information on how to get promoted, and apparently it worked. Along with Christy Eisenhower and a handful of other officers, Patton pushed for more development of armored warfare in the coming future. These thoughts resonated with Secretary of War Dwight Davis, known as Secretary of State today, I guess. But the limited military budget and prevalence of already established infantry and cavalry branches meant that the U.S. was not going to develop an armored corps until the 1940s. At the end of the war, to end all wars, the world began to act as if this could never happen again. Hey, that's what it was called, the War to End All Wars. Germany began to prepare for the next war. Instead of taxing its people to finance World War I, Germany had simply borrowed the money. It had burdened its citizens with a huge debt. To pay off this debt after the war, the German government simply printed more money. This was done even though the country's industry, agriculture, and commerce were not expanding because of the heavy reparations that had to be paid. Instead of German wealth going back to the economy, it went to pay off war debt. The rapid printing of marks, unsupported by real economic value, caused severe inflation. In the spring of 1922, about 300 German marks could buy $1 American. By early 1923, it took 50,000 marks to buy a buck. Germans needed billions of marks to pay a postage stamp. It took a shopping bag full of money just to get on a streetcar. The citizens who had little to do with starting the war now were being driven into poverty to pay for other people's mistakes. The army was limited to just 100,000 men. Their navy was limited to just a few small ships. They had no air force. The people began to look for a savior. The German military began using cars and driving them around as if they were tanks. They recognized the use of the tank as a real fighting machine. They did battle maneuvers driving Volkswagens. They would line them up as if they were a tank unit and attack a supposed enemy. The Navy got busy building huge, fast-moving cargo ships that had open areas on the decks where gun emplacements could be mounted if they were military ships. They formed glider schools and they built cargo planes that could easily be retrofitted as military aircraft. The Romans said it best: "Si vas pacem para bellum." If you want peace, prepare for war. Well, the rest of the world was preparing for peace. October 30th, 1920, Major Patton relinquished his command of the 304th Tank Brigade and became reassigned to Fort Myer as commander of the 3rd Squadron, cavalry unit. He hated this peacetime staff officer function, so he spent most of his time writing technical manuals on how to use tanks. August 23rd, Patton saved several children who had fallen off of a boat. He sailed out and somehow pulled these kids out of the water off of the coast of Salem, Massachusetts. He was awarded the Silver Life-Saving Medal for his actions. He was temporarily appointed to the General Staff Corps in Boston, Massachusetts, before being reassigned as a G1 and G2 in Hawaii. May 27th, Patton was assigned to the office of the Chief of Cavalry in Washington, D.C. They kept shipping him back and forth. I think he was looking for some place where he could excel. And excelling behind a desk, well, that just wasn't him. A short-lived experiment was conducted where they tried to merge infantry, cavalry, and artillery into a combined force. But U.S. Congress didn't fund it, and so they couldn't do it. Patton left this office in 1831, went back to Massachusetts to attend the Army War College. Believe it or not, you have to know how to fight a war. Otherwise, you're just not going to be any good at it. Congress was still buying into this whole end of all wars concept. July 32, Major Patton was executive officer of the 3rd Cavalry, which was ordered to Washington by Army Chief of Staff General Douglas MacArthur. Patton took command of the 600 troops of the 3rd Cavalry, and on July 28th, MacArthur ordered Patton's troops to advance on protesting veterans who were known as the Bonus Army, with tear gas and bayonets. He was going into battle with his own troops. Patton recognized the legitimacy of the veterans' complaints and had himself earlier refused to issue the order to employ armed forces against veterans. The Bonus Army was a group of 17,000 veterans of the U.S. involvement in World War I, their families and friends. It came to a total of 43,000 people who had gathered in Washington, D.C. It was 1932. They demanded the early cash redemption of their service bonus certificates. At the outset of the Great Depression, Congress had issued service bonus certificates that couldn't be redeemed until 1945. It's kind of like, here's your paycheck, you can't cash it for the next 13 years. President Herbert Hoover ordered the Army to clear the marchers. Patton later stated that though he found the duty most distasteful, he also felt that putting the marchers down prevented an insurrection and may have saved lives and property. Patton was promoted to lieutenant colonel in the regular army in 1934 and was transferred back to Hawaii once again to serve as the G2. He followed the growing hostilities brought on by the military in Japan. Japan had been an ally of the Allies in the Great War. They fought on the side of Britain, France, and the United States. When all of Europe was being divided up amongst the winners, Germany's more northerly Pacific islands came under the Japanese mandate, called the South Seas Mandate. Japan did not evolve into a paramilitary, a parliamentary democracy as all the European governments thought they would. By 1930, political power was falling into the hands of the Army and the Navy officers, many of whom were descendants from feudal samurai class. The officer clique hated the prosperous and liberal civilian government, and they envied and mistrusted the business class. It found a potent political weapon in the institute of the emperor, who was supposed to possess a kind of political infallibility, kind of like the Westerners had associated with the divine right of monarchs. Putting their own words in the emperor's mouth, the admirals and the generals used his pronouncements to further their own ends. He was kind of a puppet to the military. Japan's invasion of China was due essentially to Japan's desire to be an imperial power. There was both an economic and a militaristic element in this desire. Economically, Japan needed more resources, being just a small island. Once they had a foothold, their policies towards the Chinese was less than humane. Unit 731 comes to mind, but I'm not going to talk about it because this is a family friendly show, and they were anything but family friendly. Patton wrote out a plan to inter any and all Japanese living on the island of Hawaii in the event of an attack as a result of the atrocities carried out by the Japanese soldiers on the Chinese. 1937, he wrote a paper with the title Surprise, which predicted a surprise attack by the Japanese on Hawaii. Following the German army's invasion of Poland and the outbreak of World War II in Europe, the U.S. military entered a period of mobilization, and Colonel Patton sought to build up the power of the U.S. Armed Forces. Patton was then promoted to Brigadier General October 2nd, made acting division commander in November, and on April 1941 was promoted again to Major General and made commanding general of the 2nd Armored Division. Be my little general. Now that's how we learned it at Fort Knox. You had a brigadier general who had 1 star. You had a major general, that was 2 stars. A lieutenant general had 3 stars, and a general had 4. And if you managed to get high enough, the general of the army had 5. That's the rank structure of the army. Under Lieutenant General Dwight Eisenhower, the Supreme Allied Commander, Patton was assigned to help plan the Allied invasion of French North Africa as part of Operation Torch. Patton commanded the Western Task Force consisting of 33,000 men. Patton was commander of the Western Task Force. The landing, which took place November 8, 1942, were opposed by Vichy French forces. Those were French military that were working with the German High Command. French Foreign Legion was both in German military and the Allied military, and on several occasions, the French Foreign Legion actually fought each other or themselves. War leads to some really weird things. Patton landed in Casablanca, Morocco, and fought with French soldiers who were on the German side. Casablanca fell November 11th, and Patton negotiated the armistice with the French General Charles Nogues. Have you ever heard the saying, it is better to have an army of sheep led by a lion than an army of lions led by a sheep? What with our newer, kinder army, I'm afraid we're promoting a bunch of sheep. March 6, 1943, following the defeat of the U.S. 2nd Corps by German African Corps commanded by Erwin Rommel at the Battle of Kasserine Pass, Patton placed Major General Lloyd Frenendale as the commanding general of the 2nd Corps and was promoted to lieutenant general himself. Soon thereafter, he had Major General Omar Bradley assigned to his corps as its deputy commander. With orders to take a battered and demoralized formation into action in 10 days, Patton immediately introduced sweeping changes, ordering all soldiers to wear clean, pressed, and complete uniforms, establishing rigorous schedules, and requiring strict adherence to military protocol. Patton training was effective, and on March 17th, the U.S. 1st Infantry Division took Gafsa, winning the Battle of El Gueter and pushing the German and Italian armed forces back several times. During this time, Patton reported to British General Alexander, a commander of the 18th Army Group, and came into conflict with British Vice Marshal Cunningham about a lack of close air support being provided for his troops. Cunningham dispatched 3 officers to Patton's headquarters so they could convince him that the British Air Force was doing all they could to support his troops. While their meeting was taking place, 3 German airplanes attacked Patton's office, pretty much destroying the room where they were having this meeting. Patton later said, if I could find that, remember this is a family friendly show, if I could find that pilots that flew those planes, I would mail each of them a medal. By the time his forces reached Gebest, the Germans had abandoned it. He then relinquished command to General Bradley and he returned 1st Armored Corps in Casablanca to help plan Operation Husky. That would be the Allied invasion of Sicily. Patton claimed he had seen combat many times before in previous lives, including as a Roman legionnaire and as a part of the 14th century army of John the Blind of Bohemia. Before 1943 invasion of Sicily, General Alexander told Patton, "You know, George, you would have made a great marshal for Napoleon if you had lived in the 19th century." Patton said, "Yes, I was." The general believed that after he died, he would return once again to lead armies into battle. That was what his spirit was here for. For Operation Husky, the invasion of Sicily, Patton was the command of 7th United States Army. Now, some of y'all are going to find a lot of this confusing. You've got this army and this battalion and that command, and it's this huge pyramid structure of how the military is run, with the supreme commander at the very top and the private E1 at the very bottom doing all the shooting and dying. But it's how the military works. So when he's in charge of this army or this other army, they're all different components of the military. So Patton was going to be under General Montgomery of the British 8th Army. Patton's 1st Armored Corps was officially redesignated the 7th Army just before his 90,000 men landed. Their armada was hampered by wind and weather, but despite this, the 3 U.S. infantry divisions involved secured their respective beaches. They repulsed counterattacks by the German military, where Patton personally led his troops against German reinforcements from the Hermann Göring Division. Initially ordered to protect the British forces' left flank, Patton was granted permission by Alexander to take Palermo when Montgomery's forces became bogged down. Patton then set his sights on Messina. He planned for an amphibious assault, but was delayed by a lack of landing craft, and his troops did not land in Santo Stefano until August 8th, by which time the Germans and the Italians had evacuated most of their manpower and equipment. Patton ordered more landings on August 10th by the 3rd Infantry Division, which took heavy casualties but pushed the German forces back and hastened the advance on Messina. A 3rd landing was completed August 16th, and Messina fell to Patton's forces that day. When Alexander sent a transmission limiting Patton's attack on Messina, his chief of staff claimed that the message was lost in translation until the city had fallen. So in other words, they didn't get orders to stop attacking until they'd already won. How convenient. Bad things happen in war. No one side is evil, and no one side is angelic. Nice guys don't make good soldiers. When informed of the Bascari massacre of prisoners, where 72 enemy prisoners were killed, Patton told Bradley it was probably an exaggeration, but in any case tell the officers to certify that the dead men were either snipers or had attempted to escape. Bradley refused to follow this not so much order as suggestion. After he learned that the 45th Division's Inspector General found no provocation on the part of the prisoners, Patton ordered the U.S. troops involved to be tried for war crimes. Two high-profile incidents of Patton striking subordinates during the Sicily campaign attracted national controversy. August 3rd, 1943, Patton slapped and verbally abused Private Charles Kuehl at an evacuation hospital in Nicosia after he had been found to be suffering from what's known as battle fatigue. On August 10th, Patton slapped Private Paul Bennett under similar circumstances, ordering both soldiers back to the front line. Patton railed against cowardice and issued orders to his commanders to discipline any soldier making similar complaints. Real men weren't supposed to have battle fatigue. That's how things were done back then. Word of the incident reached Eisenhower, who privately reprimanded Patton and insisted he apologize. Patton did apologize to both soldiers individually as well as to the doctors who were there when it happened, and later he apologized to all the soldiers under his command in several different speeches. Eisenhower suppressed the incident in the media, but in November, journalist Drew Pearson revealed it to his radio program listeners. Criticism of Patton in the United States was harsh and included members of Congress and former generals, including Pershing. The views of the general public remained mixed on the matter, and eventually Secretary of War Stimson stated that Patton must be retained as a commander because of a need for his aggressive, winning leadership in the battle which were coming in the near future. You don't need a sheep in charge of the military. Patton did not command a force in combat for 11 months. In September, Bradley, who was Patton's junior in both rank and experience, was selected to command the 1st United States Army forming in England to prepare for Operation Overlord. If they'd already invaded Italy, why didn't they just move into Europe from there? Well, a little something called the Alps were in the way. They would have had nothing but heartaches and trouble if they had tried to drive north out of Italy at that time. So the smart thing to do is to pull most of the troops out of Italy, swing around to England, and then invade through France. Just couldn't drive north out of there. Eisenhower felt the invasion of Europe was not to be commanded by somebody with a hot head and a short fuse, and so he put Bradley in charge instead. Patton, who was a very skilled warrior, was assigned to England, where he was supposed to train the military to prepare them for the invasion. The German High Command had more respect for Patton than all of the other Allied commanders combined. They knew how Bradley would perform. They knew how Montgomery would perform in battle. They could kind of second guess all of their movements, and they figured out what they were going to do before they did it. With Patton, he was the wild card. They didn't know what he might do, and therefore they respected him and feared him. Patton was made a prominent figure in the deception scheme known as Operation Fortitude during the 1944s. Through the British network of double agents, the Allies fed German intelligence a steady stream of false reports about troop sightings that were with Patton in the 1st United States Army Group, all designed to convince the Germans that Patton was preparing this massive command for the invasions of Passy de Calais. Is it Calais? Passy de Calais. I think that's how it's pronounced. The real location of the invasion was to be Normandy, but mostly ignored by the German High Command. Patton was ordered to keep a low profile and to deceive the Germans into thinking that he was in Dover throughout the early 1944s, when he was actually training the Third Army. As a result of Operation Fortitude, the German 15th Army remained at Passy de Calais to defend against Patton's upcoming attack, which never happened. Even as the troops were pouring ashore at Normandy, the German High Command continued waiting for Patton at Calais. Patton's Third Army formed on the extreme right of the Allied landing force at Normandy and became operational in August. Patton's strategy was favored speed and aggressive action. The speed of the advancing forces that Patton's unit began to rely heavily on air reconnaissance and tactical air support. In other words, bomb the enemy as the soldiers are getting there. The Third Army had more military intelligence officers at headquarters specifically designated to coordinate airstrikes than on any other army. Each column was protected by a standing patrol of 3 to 4 P-47s and P-51 fighter bombers as a combat air patrol. The Third Army traversed 60 miles in 2 weeks. Now, that doesn't sound very far until you figure you're fighting for every inch of it. Patton's force was supplemented by intelligence from which he was briefed daily by his G2 and a supply column reaching all the way back to Normandy. Patton's offensive came to a halt August 31st, 1944, as the Third Army ran out of fuel near the Moselle River, just outside of Metz. Patton expected that the theater commander would keep fuel and supplies flowing to support successful advances, but Eisenhower favored the broad front, in other words, all the units moving forward at the same time, over supplying the guy that was out front. And so he began supplying all of the units that were creeping forward instead of giving Patton more fuel. Eisenhower gave Montgomery a higher priority for supplies for Operation Market Garden, combined with other demands on limited resources pool. Everything that the Allied military used had to come over from a ship from England. It had to land at Normandy, and then it had to be trucked forward to where the fighting was going on. In late September, a large German panzer counterattack sent expressly to stop Patton's army defeated the U.S. 4th Armored was defeated by the U.S. 4th Armored Division at the Battle of Ericourt. Despite the victory, the Third Army stayed in place as a result of Eisenhower's orders. The German commanders believed that this was because their counterstrike had been successful. They didn't realize it was because Eisenhower just wasn't giving him any gas. The halt of the Third Army during the month of September was enough to allow the Germans to strengthen their fortress at Metz. In October and November, the Third Army was mired in a near stalemate with Germans during the Battle of Metz. Both sides suffered heavy casualties. An attempt by Patton to seize Fort Driant, just south of Metz, was defeated, but by November, Metz had fallen to the Americans. Patton's decision to take this city was criticized by the German commanders, who were interviewed at the end of the war, saying that if he had bypassed the city and moved north to Luxembourg, he would have been able to cut off the German 7th Army. Like he should have known that already. In war, you don't know what's going on a lot of the times, and so you just do what you can to do what you have to. December 1944, the German army under Commander German Field Marshal von Rundstedt launched a last-ditch offensive across Belgium, Luxembourg, and northern France, known as the Battle of the Bulge. 29 divisions with 250,000 men breached a weak point in the Allied lines during the early stages of the battle, which made significant headway towards the Meuse River during the severe winter. The name bulge comes from a line where the Allies have advanced with a huge bulge sticking out to the west. Eisenhower called a meeting of all senior Allied commanders on the Western Front at the headquarters near Verdun on the morning of December 19th to plan what they were going to do next against this German assault. Patton's Third Army was engaged in heavy fighting. Guessing the intention of the Allied command meeting, Patton ordered his staff to make 3 separate operational contingency orders to disengage elements of the Third Army and do whatever it was that Eisenhower was thinking of. So Patton already knew what Eisenhower was thinking, and probably the Germans did too. When Eisenhower asked Patton how long it would take him to disengage 6 divisions to relieve the 101st Airborne, which had been trapped at Bastogne, Patton replied, "As soon as you're through with me." Patton pointed out he had already worked up an operational order for a counterattack. Eisenhower didn't really believe him, so he ordered him to wait until December 22nd to relieve the 101st, thinking it would take him that long to get ready. Patton left the conference room, phoned his command, and uttered 2 words: "Play ball." This code phrase initiated the prearranged operational order that Patton's staff had already put into place. All they had to do was tell the men, "Attack." The Third Army moved out, heading towards Bastogne. Patton would reposition 6 full divisions from their positions on the Saar River in a matter of minutes as opposed to weeks. Within a few days, more than 133,000 vehicles were en route to an offensive, followed by supporting units carrying 62,000 tons of supplies. Patton met with Bradley to review the impending advance with intentions of attacking the rear supply lines of the Germans and capturing most of the units where they were now far from Germany, but Bradley told Patton that he should focus on Bastogne more. The weather was hampering air support, so Patton asked his chaplain to come up with a weather prayer. He did, and it worked. The chaplain was awarded the Bronze Star for his prayer. If you watch the movie Patton, you'll have seen that. And if you didn't watch the movie Patton, what are you waiting for? I've seen it a couple of times. It's fairly accurate. Except for George C. Scott. Doesn't sound anything like Patton. On December 26, 1944, the 1st Spearhead units of the 4th Armored Division reached Bastogne, opening a corridor for relief and resupply of the besieged fortress. There's a bit of a controversy whether or not the 101st Airborne actually needed rescuing or not. They say all they needed was just a little more supplies, and they would have had the Germans right where they wanted them. After all, when the German commander met with the 101st Airborne commander to talk about surrender, the 101st Airborne commander said that they didn't have the means or the facilities to take that many German prisoners. He acted like he thought the Germans were trying to surrender to him. That's also where the term nuts was sent over the radio, but once again, if you didn't see the movie Battle of the Bulge, what are you waiting for? I've seen it several times too. And it was full of soldiers, full of actors who had been soldiers on both sides of the conflict. February, the Germans were in full retreat. By the 23rd, the U.S. 94th Infantry Division crossed the Saar River and established a bridgehead through which Patton pushed units into the Saarland. Patton had insisted upon an immediate crossing of the river against the advice of his officers. Once again, they were going like, "Oh, we shouldn't go so fast," and he was like, full speed ahead, no matter what. Once again, Patton found other commands giving priority on gasoline and supplies. To obtain more fuel, the Third Army ordnance units passed themselves off as being First Army personnel. In other words, they were stealing supplies from other units of the same army. They also went to the First Army's supply depot and requisitioned things. It's not really stealing if you're doing that, but it's still, you're not supposed to do that. An, an example of Patton's sarcastic wit was broadcast when he received orders to bypass Trier, as it had been decided that it would take 4 divisions needed in order to capture it. When the message arrived, Trier had already fallen. Patton rather caustically replied, "Have taken Trier with 2 divisions. Do you want me to give it back?" By April, resistance against the Third Army was tapering off, and the force's main efforts turned to managing the 400,000 German prisoners of war. April 14th, Patton was promoted to general. That's the 4-star general, a promotion long advocated by Stimson in recognition of Patton's battle accomplishments. Third Army was ordered towards Bavaria in Czechoslovakia, anticipating a last stand by the Nazi Germans. He was reportedly appalled to learn that the Red Army would be allowed to take Berlin, a feeling that the Soviet Union was a bigger threat to the U.S. Army's advance to Pilsen, but was stopped by Eisenhower from reaching Prague, Czechoslovakia. Patton asked for a command in the Pacific Theater as soon as the war in Europe had come to a halt, begging Marshall to bring him to the war in any way possible. Marshall said he would be able to do so only if China was able to secure a major port for his entry. Secretary of War Stimson decided that Patton would not be sent to the Pacific, but would return to Europe in the occupational army assignment. Patton was appointed as military governor of Bavaria, where he led the Third Army to denazify efforts. Patton was particularly upset when learning of the end of the war against Japan, writing in his diary, "Yet another war has come to an end, and with it my usefulness to the world." Wrong button. Patton attracted controversy as military governor when it was noted that several former Nazi Party members continued to hold political posts in the region. When responding to the press about this subject, Patton repeatedly compared Nazis to Democrats and Republicans, as saying that most people with experience in the infrastructure management had been compelled to join the Nazi Party during the war, which was true. If you didn't join the party, you didn't keep your job. If you didn't keep your job, you didn't eat. So a lot of people were Nazis who weren't really Nazis. Patton's final assignment was to command the U.S. 15th Army based in Bad Nurem. The 15th Army at this point consisted only of a small headquarters staff working to compile the history of the war in Europe. He intended to discuss with his wife whether he would continue in a stateside posting or simply retire from the Army. Patton's chief of staff invited him on a pheasant hunt trip near Speyer. The 1938 Cadillac limousine they were riding in collided with an army truck at low speeds. Patton hit his head on the glass partition that separated the front and the back seat. He began to bleed from a gash in his head, and he complained that he couldn't feel his body. He was paralyzed, and he was having difficulty breathing. Taken to the hospital in Heidelberg, Patton was discovered to have a compressed fracture and dislocation of the cervical third and fourth vertebrae, resulting in a broken neck, cervical spinal cord injury that would render him paralyzed from the neck down. That's the official story. Patton spent the next 12 days in a spinal traction to decrease the pressure on his spine. He is supposed to have died in his sleep of pulmonary edema and congestive heart failure December 21st, 1945, at the age of 60. At least, that's what those people want us to believe. Patton was taken to the Army hospital, where he made rapid strides in recovery over the course of the next 12 days. His physician had given him a medical clearance to make the transatlantic flight back home, when suddenly old Blood and Guts was pronounced dead. No autopsy was performed. All the reports and investigations into the accident have mysteriously disappeared. In 1979, an American spy with a sterling reputation named Douglas Bazata claimed that he had been ordered by the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which later became the CIA. He had been ordered to kill Patton and make his murder look like an accident. Another story is from a military officer who was on hand at the scene of the accident, Lieutenant Peter Babalis of the 818th Military Police. Around 11:45 a.m., him and his partner, Lieutenant John Metz, had passed Patton's car, going in the opposite direction. After hearing the crash, they turned around to provide whatever aid they could. Babalis made an official investigation of the circumstances surrounding the accident, and he found that Patton's driver, Private Horace Woodring, and the driver of the truck that hit Patton's car, Robert Thomas, were both directly responsible for the accident. Almost immediately after the accident, the Army's Criminal Investigation Division spirited Thompson out of Germany and sent him to England, where he was to stay for several days. The reason for his sudden trip to England was for his own protection. Douglas Bazata and his accomplice followed the general's car, and when Patton stopped at a Roman ruin alongside the road, Bazata put something in the window of Patton's auto that would leave an opening for a rifle shot. He said that they had an army truck that would run parallel to Patton's car and then would deliberately turn into it. When the truck hit Patton's car, a shot was fired, severely wounding Patton but not killing him. Bazata said that in the confusion of the moment, he went to aid of the wounded general and then left among the confusion in the unfolding events. He then said that he went to Patton's hospital with a poison that had been made by both he and his accomplice, but he was unable to get to Patton's room. Bazata said that the man who finally did kill Patton went into the hospital room and used cyanide, which would cause heart failure and an embolism. After a writer working on Patton's murder found a restricted OSS order while searching files at the National Archive that said that Bazata and other unnamed American officers met in Washington, D.C. The meetings occurred in 1943 in a hotel so as to not attract any unwanted attention. Why would one of the most successful generals in the U.S. military be murdered? In the months before his death, Patton had become a powerful critic of the American government, its conduct of World War II, and its policies towards the Soviets. He planned to resign from the military after returning to the U.S. and then begin a major public speaking tour against American political leadership. As one of our most celebrated war heroes, his denunciation would certainly have a huge impact. Following World War II, Patton considered the next war was going to be the Cold War with the Soviets. Although a wartime ally of America, they would soon be an enemy. He wanted to fight the Soviets, knowing they were spent after the war and thus vulnerable. He wanted to push them all the way back to their borders. Patton said he defeated the wrong enemy, referring to the Soviets. U.S. investigators discovered large numbers of former German soldiers who should have been discharged were kept in readiness at Alpine camps under Patton's orders. Patton thought they would be good as a spearhead to any assault. It was this discovery that precipitated Patton's removal as governor of Bavaria. The war was over and we won, kind of. Well, the Nazis never surrendered. Only the German military surrendered. Look at all the Nazi members brought to the U.S. under Operation Paperclip. How different would the U.S., as well as the entire world, have been had Patton been allowed to live and return home? Well, that's something we will never know because it didn't happen in our timeline. Maybe somewhere out there there's another dimension where Patton came back home and things turned out differently. I would have talked about Patton's murder a lot more, but there is just so little out there to be read. It's almost as if somebody doesn't want us reading it. I could only find 2 files to go over, so I hope you enjoyed the show. Dave, I hope this met with your requirements. Like I said, that was all I could find about his murder, but the man was something else. Until next time, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murdered 3. Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?